gratitude to the organizers of this really splendid conference, and particularly for Jordi, for the privilege and the honor that they gave me in bringing me here to chair this session, and especially for the privilege of chairing this particular session with Jules Coleman's presentation. There are two unwritten rules regarding the chair in an academic conference. The first rule requires that the chair or the speaker, the chairperson say that the speaker already has a worldwide reputation and a well-deserved one, so that he and his achievements need no introduction. The second rule requires that the chairperson, nevertheless, proceeds to give an introduction. Obviously, although this is not quite a logical contradiction, it is not easy to respect both these unwritten rules. But I will do my best to apply them, and therefore I will make an introduction, but a brief one, that will be a simple reminder of what all of you know perfectly well. Jules Coleman was trained in both philosophy and law, and he is a professor in both the law school and the philosophy department at Yale University, with the title Wesley Newcomb Hofeld Professor of Jurisprudence and Professor of Philosophy. Indeed, he teaches philosophy, philosophy of law, ethics, but also more serious subjects, which is torts, and he writes in all these fields, including more serious ones like rock and roll. On all these subjects, there are a very large number of books and articles, legal philosophy, torts, constitutional law, and I can quote only a few that most people are familiar with. Rights and Wrongs, Markets, Morals and the Law, the Oxford Handbook of Jurisprudence and Philosophy of Law, together with Scott Shapiro, who's here, The Practice of Principle. This latter book has been described as, I quote, perhaps the most developed statement of inclusive legal positivism. Indeed, Professor Coleman is generally recognized as one of the main exponents of this important development in legal theory. Among the marks of recognition that he received is an invitation to give the Clarendon Lectures in Law at Oxford, and 2 years ago an important conference was organized at the University of Bologna on his work. I'm very impatient, as you are all, to listen to Professor Jules Coleman, and I give him the floor immediately. Professor Coleman.
Thank you very much. Is this okay? It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for holding this wonderful conference. And I hope that I can make a valuable contribution to it, and that my contribution will actually be in virtue of what I say today. Among the things that I'm going to argue for today is, unfortunately, that inclusive legal positivism is not an interesting subject. Having made my reputation on it, I feel it's now appropriate to leave it. Actually, I'm not going to read my paper, but hopefully this will make it easier to follow. I'm going to speak in this way and explore some central ideas that I think influence jurisprudence. So mostly what I'm interested in doing is the following. I'm interested in reconceptualizing and rethinking the fundamental projects of jurisprudence and moving us away from a focus which we've had for a very long time on certain debates which I find misleading and unhelpful, and moving us into exploring fundamental issues and reformulating some of the problems that we've focused on for long periods of time in somewhat different ways, which I hope are more precise and clear, and I hope the ways in which I formulate them will enable us to make progress on their resolution. So I have 3 projects that are connected. The first is to raise some doubts about, and more than that, to undermine and dismantle some of the conventional wisdom of contemporary jurisprudence. That will be mostly what I focus on today. I will discuss 2 of the nuggets of the conventional wisdom. One is the separability thesis, and the second is the distinction between descriptive and normative jurisprudence and their relationship to positivism on the one hand and non-positivistic jurisprudence on the other hand. The second thing that I will do, not today and not in detail, if I mention it briefly today, it will be to articulate a general structure of jurisprudence that distinguishes among us a variety of different kinds of questions. Questions about the content of law, which I think of as the metaphysical question about the nature of law. Legal facts are themselves not basic facts. They are facts in virtue of other facts that determine them. And the question is, what are the determinants of legal content? I take that to be the metaphysical question. The semantic question, a question about how we are to understand or interpret judgments of law. The metaethical question, that is, if we interpret them to be judgments about what we ought to do, how we understand judgments about what we ought to do. The epistemic questions, which include questions about the nature of inference and justification in law, and finally normative questions, questions about the relationship of law to reason. And the third project, which I will focus on to some extent today, are questions about law's, what I call law's place, whether we fundamentally see law as continuous with other aspects of our social life and social practices, or whether we focus primarily on law and think of it as continuous with morality. And I will clarify that. But I want to begin my comments by saying something about 2 nuggets of conventional wisdom in jurisprudence, the first being the separability thesis, and the second the methodological distinction between so-called descriptive and normative jurisprudence. I will say very little about the separability thesis and considerably more about the methodological debate because it figures more prominently in my discussion in the third part of the project. Now, the separability thesis can be understood in a variety of different ways. Leslie Green, in a recent paper, claimed that Hart held the broadest interpretation of it, that there was, in fact, no necessary connections between law and morality, and that, in fact, such a view is false. It's also true, however, that even if Hart did hold this promiscuous interpretation of the separability thesis, he also held a narrower one, which was his focus, which had something to do with the conditions, as it's been currently interpreted, conditions of legal validity, that morality was not a condition of legal validity. And so this was sometimes phrased as the view that whether or not something is the law is one thing, and whether it has moral merit or not is another. And this was thought to be interpreted, which is in fact not a good interpretation, but it's nevertheless thought to be plausibly interpreted as a claim that morality is not a necessary condition of legal validity. And this is thought to be the paradigmatic of legal positivism. Now, the things I want to say about the separability thesis are as follows: that we can understand it in either of two, we can probably understand it in a million ways. We certainly can understand it as a claim about legal validity, and we can also understand it as a claim about the existence condition of legal systems. As a claim about legal validity, it is a claim that positivists endorse, but we should not ascribe it to natural lawyers. As a claim about the existence conditions of legal systems, it's a claim that is endorsed by, or rejected by natural lawyers, but we should not suppose that legal positivists endorse it. And so the conclusion of the argument in this section will be that the separability thesis is distracting from more fundamental questions in jurisprudence. And in fact, two legal positivists who I know reasonably well, one I know better than the other, that's Joseph Raz. The other is me, who I don't know that well. Both reject the separability thesis. So one would be hard-pressed to advance the view that the separability thesis is the central distinguishing feature of legal positivism. So let me make this argument rather briefly, since I'm not particularly interested in it, and I've made versions of this argument before. Roughly the thought is that if it's true that a law can be valid in spite of it being immoral or bad, then if the separability thesis is supposed to distinguish legal positivists from natural lawyers, then one would suppose that natural lawyers are committed to the idea that bad laws or immoral laws are conceptually impossible. And that seems to be, or involves some notion of some kind of contradiction. That seems to be a view that we don't want to impose upon natural lawyers. So when a natural lawyer says that a bad law is no law at all, we should be understanding them to be making a different kind of claim than the one that they appear to be making. So we should understand them, for example, as to be making a claim as to how one should proceed in thinking about jurisprudence. That is, as making a methodological claim. And among the candidates of methodological claims that we should understand them to be making is the following, that one should proceed in jurisprudence by looking at the successful cases and not at the failed cases. The successful cases of law are ones in which law binds the conscience, or in which law succeeds at what it aspires to do, and what it aspires to do on this view is to impose obligations. So when we proceed in jurisprudence, we should be studying law which succeeds at its aspiration, which is to impose obligations, and that law in the full sense is law that is successful, and we should proceed in jurisprudence by focusing on the successful case of law. And this is a methodological claim. And so in some sense, whether or not it's a plausible claim is a different question, but it's no longer an obvious claim that a positivist has to disagree with. That is, the difference is not captured by the separability thesis. It's captured by a different way of thinking about how we should approach jurisprudence, right? and I have a good deal more to say about this in the paper that I don't want to repeat because I want to say, I'm assuming that you would have read the paper or you will read the paper, and I want to say things that are novel and distinctive and worthy of more discussion than in my mind this is. The second thing is sometimes the separability thesis is taken to be a claim about legal systems and not about the conditions of legal validity. And here, the thought is that a certain kind of legal system, a form or law is a scheme or form of governance, and the idea is that nothing can count as a legal system, a distinctive form of governance, unless it satisfies certain kinds of moral ideals, or unless it embodies or expresses certain kinds of moral values, and that therefore, or meet certain kinds of moral constraints, and therefore some things which count as legal systems in the positivist picture would not in the natural lawyer's picture. So that positivism is understood as a view about the existence conditions of legal systems such that there are no moral constraints on them, or that it's not a necessary condition for the existence of a legal system that it satisfy or embody or express certain kinds of moral ideals, and that natural law theory holds that that's not the case, and that that's what separates natural law theory from legal positivism. But again, this seems to me to be artificial and not helpful, since there's not, what positivists have wanted to insist on is the possibility of evil legal systems. And evil legal systems are possible even if it's true that everything that counts as a legal system embodies certain kinds of moral constraints or expresses certain kinds of moral values. And we could think of a couple of them. For example, you might think that nothing is a legal system unless it treats people as agents, that is responsive to reason, and think that individuals who are responsive to reason are respected a certain kind of way, that involves a certain kind of value, and it's not merely just a fact, it's a way of thinking of or conceiving of people that's valuable and desirable, and that nothing could count as a legal system which failed to treat people as responsive to reason in a certain kind of way. Now, there's no reason on earth why a positivist would have to deny that. Indeed, a positivist can accept considerably more by way of constraints, moral, but broadly speaking, moral or evaluative constraints on the existence of legal systems. So I don't think anybody wants to deny that bad laws can be laws, and no one wants to deny that there can be moral constraints on the existence of legal systems. In addition, if one just looks at the literature of the vast majority of positivists, many of us are committed to the idea that there are fundamental moral concepts which are central to our understanding of law. Raz, for example, claims that law necessarily claims to be a legitimate authority, and by legitimate authority certainly has in mind that the reasons that the law purports to provide are moral reasons, legitimate moral reasons. So to understand law is to understand its connection to morality in a certain kind of way. In his recent book, Scott Shapiro claims that what distinguishes law from other systems of planning is that it necessarily seeks to resolve a certain category of moral problems, so that the very idea of law presupposes a connection to morality. Hart, of course, claimed that there was a minimal moral content to law, and so on. So I don't really think there's much to be gained by focusing on anything that looks like or smells like or sounds like the separability thesis. And that the separability thesis is distracting and misleading from more fundamental questions in jurisprudence, and we would do well to leave it behind. The next distinction that is central to conventional wisdom is that legal positivists are by and large descriptive jurisprudence, and that non-legal positivists, in particular natural lawyers of one sort or another, methodologically speaking, are normative jurisprudence. Now, of course, I am ignoring a certain kind of debate or a certain set of positions of so-called normative positivists who think that positivism could be defended on normative grounds, or people who think that, like Leah Murphy and others, that the concept of law is not something that we can identify at all because of the nature of deep disagreement about it or some idea of that sort, and that the only project we have are, broadly speaking, engineering projects. I'm actually just focusing on people who think that we can uncover the nature or essence of law, but the project of doing so can be approached in either of two ways only. And so I'm interested in that group of philosophers who would include Raz on the one hand and Dworkin on the other hand and Hart on one hand and myself, who think that we can in fact identify the content of the concept of law or explore the nature or the essence of law, but that there are distinctive philosophical tools which are appropriate for doing so. And among this group, it's largely thought that positivists are those who are committed to the idea that the way to do this is, broadly speaking, through something or other that's descriptive or conceptual, and that normative people who think that the content of law includes normative or moral facts are committed to the idea that the project of jurisprudence is normative and can only be pursued by seeing it as falling out of first-order political philosophy, right? So those who believe that the content of law is fixed by social facts alone, or that only social facts can fix the determinants of legal content, which is what I think is distinctive of positivism, are thought to believe that the content of the concept is revealed to us through some form or other of conceptual analysis, whereas those like Dworkin who believe that the content of law is fixed by normative as well as by social facts are committed to normative jurisprudence. That is, they believe that an analysis of the concept of law can proceed only by addressing problems in first-order political philosophy. Now, it's an important point, in my mind, to see that this is not just misleading, but seriously mistaken. And uncovering the ways in which it's mistaken will allow us to see deep and fundamental points about jurisprudence. So my own view is, in ridding ourselves of focusing on the separability thesis, we just clear the deck to approach problems in a different way that are more promising. But in ridding ourselves of this view that attributes to positivists a kind of descriptive jurisprudence and to non-positivists a normative jurisprudence, we don't merely clear the deck, we actually gain a deep insight into the fundamental issues of jurisprudence, and that is what I want to focus on now. So the way to do this, seems to me, is to take the leading, by my lights, leading legal positivist of our time, Joseph Raz, and I hesitate to call him a natural lawyer, but the leading, and I hesitate to call him leading in this august audience, but one of the leading non-legal positivists, Ronald Dworkin, and show that at some fundamental and deep way, while one is paradigmatic of positivism and the other is paradigmatic of non-positivism, they are much, much more alike in fundamental and important ways than one would think. And seeing the ways in which they're alike will deepen our understanding of what is distinctive of a variety of different kinds of jurisprudential views. So let's start with Dworkin, because most of my focus will be on Raz. Dworkin thinks that the fundamental question in political, or one of the fundamental questions in political philosophy is, what justifies the use of collective force against persons? Or we might think of this as what justifies political coercion? Or when can the use of force by all against some be justified? You might think that one answer to this question is when justice requires it. But of course it turns out to be, and only when justice requires it. But of course it turns out to be the case that there are all sorts of injustices that we might impose upon one another which don't warrant or call for the collective use of force of anyone against anyone else. And there are also cases in which the collective use of force is justified for reasons other than to see to it that justice is done. But the deeper point that Dworkin makes is that to understand law is to understand it as necessarily a putative answer to this question. That law is to be understood as an answer to the question, when is the collective use of force justified? And the law purports to be an answer in the sense that whenever it's required by law. All right? So to understand what law is to understand it in terms of it being a potential answer to a question in political philosophy. And so one cannot understand or approach jurisprudence other than seeing it in terms of this question in first order political philosophy. So the methodology of jurisprudence, namely to uncover the nature of law, is itself an activity of first order political philosophy. And that's the argument, the structure of the argument, for why, in his case, jurisprudence calls for a normative methodology. One cannot approach the question about the nature of the essence of law other than through the question of political philosophy, what justifies coercion. Now, it turns out, of course, interestingly, that for Raz, one approaches the question about what the nature or the essence of law is in virtue of a fundamental question in political philosophy as well. Namely, what is the nature of legitimate authority? Because after all, those of you who recall, it's Raz's view that law claims to be a legitimate authority, and it's this fact about law that imposes constraints on the kind of thing that law can be. So the way we come to approach or understand the nature, the content of the concept of law is by seeing it in the light of its relationship to this fundamental question in first order political morality, namely what is the nature of legitimate authority. And it's once we understand the nature of legitimate authority that we will come to understand the constraints that law is claiming to be necessarily a legitimate authority imposes on the kind of thing that law is. So we approach the concept of law through first order political morality. All right. So what the first point to make is that it's just simply a mistake to think that positivism travels with, broadly speaking, conceptual analysis, whereas non-positivist positions travel with approaching law through first order political morality. That's not the deepest point, but that's the first point. The deeper point, the next deepest point, seems to me to be the following. If we focus on Raz for a second, and focus especially on his rejection of inclusive legal positivism. People have tended to, let me put it another way. There are two different kinds of objections which Raz and Razians, but more Razians than Raz, have offered to inclusive legal positivism, right? One is that it's incompatible with law's claim to legitimate authority. And I and other people have responded to this objection, I think, convincingly. And I don't want to repeat it, because that's not the deep objection. The deep objection seems to me much more powerful and much harder to respond to. And in fact, when you understand it, if you're like me, you'll lose your conviction that it's worth responding to, because there's something much deeper at stake than the debate between inclusive and exclusive legal positivists. And that objection goes something like this. Morality always applies to everybody. So the question, under what conditions can the law incorporate morality, is misguided. Rather, if we understand ourselves as agents under the law, we are, in the first instance, always required to do what morality requires of us to do, what the balance of reasons requires us to do. And so the thought that the law can incorporate morality is misguided. The right way to think about it is something like the following. There's always morality. And our burden, our responsibility as agents, is to always act on what it is the balance of moral reasons requires of us. The question is, when can we act on reasons other than the reasons that morality requires of us? The answer to which is when morality so directs us. When does morality so direct us to act on reasons other than the reasons that morality? When we will do better acting on those other reasons in doing what morality requires of us than we will in acting on our own assessment of what those reasons require of us. When is that the case? The law claims that's always the case with regard to the law. That is, law is carved out of morality by morality. That is, law counsels appealing to something other than, morality counsels appealing to something other than morality directly, namely law, when it's the case that acting on legal reasons or legal directives means that you are more likely to do what morality requires of you than you would, successfully, than you would by acting on your own assessment of the balance of moral reasons. Right? So law is carved out of morality by morality through the authority relationship. When it's true that you will do better acting on the basis of the reasons that the law provides than you will acting on your own assessment of morality, then and only then is it right for you to act on the basis of those reasons. So the thought that law can incorporate morality is backwards. The question is, when does morality incorporate law? That is, or another way to put it is, when does morality direct us to act on the basis of something other than morality, in this case, law? So the picture that has at the heart of inclusive legal positivist versus exclusive legal positivist picture is completely mistaken, because the picture in that debate is there's law and there's morality as different, but in some sense on the same level, equal normative systems. And the question is, when can one, in the case law, incorporate the other? And under what conditions can it do so? And of course, the debate between inclusive and exclusive legal positivists was inclusive legal positivists thought that, of course, there were conditions under which it could, right? And exclusive legal positivists thought there are never conditions under which it could, because it would, doing so, violate law's claim to legitimate authority or something along these lines. But in fact, that is just the wrong way to see the issue. Rather, if Raz is right, there is always morality, and law is carved out from it. Law is continuous with morality. It's not an alternative normative system. We only understand it in its relationship to morality. And that the key concept central to our understanding it is that of authority. And in particular, the service conception of authority that he offers. All right. So the inclusive-exclusive debate is taking place at the wrong level. It's not understanding the deep connection within the Razian picture of the relationship of law to morality. All right. First point. The next point is for people who are interested in positivism and Raz, and not in things like the separability thesis, which can't possibly be interesting by comparison to this, is the following. Positivism for Raz is not where he begins, it's where he ends. It's not the point of departure of his thesis, it's the conclusion of the thesis. Why? Because if morality carves out law under certain sets of conditions, it's his view that in order for it to operate successfully in that way, law must be the sort of thing whose content and identity is determined only by social facts, facts about behavior and attitude, and not by appealing to moral considerations. So in other words, the theory of authority as central to understanding the relationship between law as being carved out from morality is the idea that there is a firewall between law and morality such that the content of law can only be fixed by facts about behavior and attitudes and not by moral facts. In order for law to be the sort of thing that morality counsels, that you appeal to in order to act in ways that meet the demands of morality, there must be this firewall. Now, you can reject that position. That's a different issue. But the positivism is the last claim, namely that the content of law is fixed by social facts alone. That is not the point of departure for Raz. That's the conclusion of this entire picture. Now, finally, no, I'm not done. I mean, I could go on for days, and in fact, I might. I'm one of these people who enjoys being on a roll, and once I get on a roll, I don't want to hear any questions, and I don't want to be disturbed, and so on. And I don't care if you fall asleep. The Dworkin picture, right? Now remember, we have Dworkin and Raz are both committed to thinking that you can't get at law other than through first-order political philosophy. But for Dworkin, you see, the fundamental relationship is coercion, not authority. The fundamental question in political philosophy is not the question of what constitutes legitimate authority. He doesn't have morality being carved out, law being carved out of morality by morality. He sees the fundamental question as the question of political coercion to which law is an answer, necessarily. And on his view, so law makes a difference in what politically states are justified in doing. That is, when it's the law, states are justified in acting in certain kinds of ways, namely imposing coercion on individuals, all right? So it's not like law is carved out of morality. That is, law, the relationship between law and morality for Dworkin is that law impacts political morality in certain kinds of ways by licensing certain kinds of actions. Now, in order for law to relate to morality in this way, for Dworkin, the law itself has to be transparent or translucent to morality. And of course, it's unsurprising, therefore, that one gets Dworkinian interpretivism. That is, what the law is a set of principles of political morality which provide the best explanation and fit of it in the light of what would justify the use of coercive force. So it turns out not only that the claim that positivists and natural lawyers must adopt different methodological stances is mistaken, but when we see the ways in which it's mistaken in this particular case, we see not only that one can approach the content of the concept of law as a problem in political morality, but we see a deeper point, and that is a kind of continuity between law and morality, both within distinctive positivist positions and non-positivist positions. So the thought that we should approach jurisprudence by asking whether morality and law are separate or connected in a certain way is not helpful. Not helpful at all. We will be misled. The deeper point is to explore the ways in which they are thought to be connected in certain views, positivist or not positivist. And by focusing on things like the separability thesis, we will just be distracted and we will not see the deeper issues. Now, one of the things which falls out of this view is not just that the separability thesis is misleading, distracting, and uninteresting, but also that the dispute between inclusive and exclusive legal positivists is at a level, it's a perfectly legitimate dispute, but it's at a level of understanding that if we focus on it too narrowly and carefully, we will miss the deeper and larger issues in which it turns out not to be that interesting a dispute, in which it seems even to be a poorly formulated dispute, a dispute about whether law can incorporate morality, because that involves a picture of the way law and morality are related to one another, which may not be correct as two, as it were, equal normative systems. Right. Now, the final implication of this is what I would like to speak about for a couple of minutes. And that is, why have the issues in jurisprudence lasted forever? It's not just because we would get out of business and we'd have nothing to do, and it's not just because there's a lot of bad philosophy involved in what people do, and it's not just because people have focused on the wrong questions. There are some deep and abiding differences that are hard to resolve. One of the deep and abiding differences is the one I'd like to point your attention to. And that is whether or not, what I call it in general, law's place. And that is whether you want to see law as fundamentally continuous with other aspects of our social life, right? That law is, above all else, a large-scale social organization, a way of organizing ourselves collectively, in order to regulate our affairs with one another. Now, we do that on a small scale as well. We do that on our own scale by forming future-oriented intentions. We organize our life in this way. We regulate our response to certain phenomena in the world. We make plans. We act with other people. We form groups, associations, corporations, and law. And there's a sense in which there's a continuity between those. And we might ask ourselves, what is the structure or the fundamental normative features of this form of social organization? And therefore, what sort of normativity is fundamental to it? And we can approach law through what I would think of its fundamental sociality. And one could approach jurisprudence this way. Understand the nature of law by seeing its continuity with other aspects of our social life. And I would think that someone like me is someone who adopts this approach. And I think Hart is someone who adopts this approach. And I know that Scott Shapiro is someone who adopts it. To see the continuity between social rules. Hart's a good example, right? In this regard. But the alternative view is to see law as continuous with morality in a variety of different ways. Either as, what difference does it make in moral space? What difference does law make? How does law affect what morally we ought to do? Right? And of course, after all, if Raz and others are right, that among the things that law claims is that it makes a certain kind of difference in moral space. Right? Now, people who focus on this, it doesn't matter whether you're my whole point is, it doesn't mean, positivist or non-positivist, you can still be driven to the idea that the right way to understand law is by seeing it as continuous with morality in a certain way. And that's clearly Raz, as well as Dworkin, as well as many natural lawyers. Now, this difference is significant because people who focus on the continuity of law with morality, when they explore the sociality of law, they're only interested in those aspects of the social world and our social life together, the sociality of law, that's necessary to support their claims about the relationship of law to morality. Right. So Dworkin is very thin on social dimensions of law, institutional dimensions of law. But so is Raz. Raz is very thin on the social dimensions of law. All right. Others, like if you start in the other extreme with Hart, very thick on the social dimensions of law, very puzzling claims about the way in which law connects with our moral life. Very unsatisfying for a lot of people, right? Now, I'm not going to resolve this dispute now. I need to have a career for myself in what follows, beyond today, right? But what I want to say is this is an enduring problem because it's perfectly plausible to approach law in either of these ways. To fundamentally ask, what difference does it make in its moral life, and what social nature do we have to ascribe to it in order for us to offer a plausible explanation of its capacity to make the difference that it makes? But it's also plausible to understand law fundamentally from the point of view of how it's connected to and continuous with other aspects of our social life. It seems to me, however, that we will never approach these questions in a useful and meaningful way if we continue to allow ourselves to be prisoners of the conventional wisdom that has informed our field, but has also paralyzed it. Thank you.
Well, this idea that morality always applies and law is carved out by morality, well, it seems to me that if you want to explain what a legal obligation is with this theory, you have a serious problem, because it won't work for the bad man. It doesn't explain what a legal obligation is from the bad man's point of view. And it seems to me that a theory about what a legal obligation is needs to explain that. It's not enough that it explains what a morally motivated person might have for reason for following the law and so forth. And I don't know what that makes me. Maybe that makes me a legal realist, someone would say. I always thought it made me a legal positivist. What do you say?
Well, I don't care. I don't care what it makes you. I mean, you must care about this, and if I started caring too much about what it made you, I'd see a therapist. But I think, look, I'm trying to explain the Razian picture. So let me just say, my order of business here was to explain how one can be a positivist and approach the problem and use Raz as an example. Now, but I can't answer your question quite apart from my discussion, which was a discussion of Raz. And that is, I think it's a good question in general to ask what content we're to give to the idea of a legal obligation, beyond the very idea that it's an obligation which is imposed by law, right? So, here's the way I think about it. It's a statement that you ought to do X by the law, right? Or even that you're obligated to do X by the law. Now, I think the question is a semantic question. How are we to understand that assertion? Now, on some views, we are to understand that assertion as a claim that's merely a prediction about what will happen to you if you act in a certain kind of way, right? On other views, we can understand it as expressing the idea that you have a distinctive kind of obligation that is sui generis, or in some other way, it's a legal obligation, and then the burden would be on you to explain what you mean by a legal obligation, beyond the obvious point that it's an obligation which is conferred by a legal rule, right? Or you can adopt a view which is a view that Raz adopts, and which I adopt, and I think other people adopt, that assertion should be understood, the semantics of that assertion, it should be understood as a claim about what, from the moral point of view, from the legal point of view, you have moral reason to do. So it's a claim, a claims of legal obligations, not legal obligations, because legal obligations are things. I'm talking about the assertion that you have that it is the law that you ought to do phi. I understand that as a statement that from the law's point of view, you have a compelling moral reason to phi. Now, that's perfectly understandable to the bad man, right? The bad man can say, so understood, from the law's point of view, I have moral reason to phi. That's not from my point of view I have moral reason to phi. Or I may have no moral reason to phi, or I don't care if I have moral reason to phi. I don't care what the law thinks. What I do worry about the law is that they think, in virtue of the fact that from their point of view I have moral reason to phi, that if I fail to phi, then I am subject to the following sanction. So I don't see that there's a problem at all here. That is, there's an assertion. The question is, what's the semantics of the assertion? Can bad men understand the semantics of the assertion? Yes, of course. The semantics of the assertion I'm asserting is that from the law's point of view, I have moral reason to phi, and the bad man can understand that as a claim that he or she takes to be false, but can nevertheless, you don't have to introduce the idea that he's got a legal obligation. That doesn't help. Rather, what helps is the idea that the bad man thinks that the claim being asserted by the law is false, but I have good reason to act on it for other kinds. I'm well motivated to act on it for other kinds of reasons, namely that because the law thinks I have moral reason, it's going to think that they're justified in punishing me when I fail to phi, and I have to respond to that fact.
So now we have a problem because there are six people who have asked, who want to ask questions.
That's not a problem unless I'm
so-
expected to answer them.
So I think it's wise not to take any more. So there's this gentleman who raised his hand first. Here, you. And
I can't see.
yes, and then after that, Robert Alexi and Mireille Buligin. Yes, I saw.
He needs a microphone. He needs a microphone, I need an argument.
I'm Fábio Chacaira from McMaster University, Canada. There's one step in your argument that isn't very clear to me, and this is the step in which you try to show that Raz, in trying to explain the nature of law, engages in first-order political questions. And I'm not sure. What it seems to me that he's doing is analyzing, given an analysis of the concept of legitimate authority. And I'm not sure to do that is to engage in first-order questions, right? If someone writes a work on the concept of morality, we'd probably classify that work as a work in meta-ethics, not a work in normative ethics. So even if elsewhere in his work, Raz engages in first-order questions, does he need to do that when analyzing the concept of legitimate authority in order to elucidate the nature of law?
Well, he's offering a substantive theory of political authority, and I mean, I have a lot more to say about that. I'm not going to reject your initial point, right? If it's just a question of analyzing the concept of legitimate authority, all right? But the analysis that he offers of legitimate authority, I mean, I'm going to accept your point, but now I'm going to make a point about his analysis. Okay, and that is that the particular theory he offers of legitimate authority, which he says comes from our actual practices and is the one that we have in play, actually is deeply revisionist of our ordinary conception of legitimate authority, and is because our ordinary conception of legitimate authority, I mean, this is a point I've made and other people have made, is that it's a relationship between persons, and his account of legitimate authority is this relationship between persons and reasons. So it's a deeply revisionist account, and that revisionist account is ultimately supported on considerations in normative political philosophy. So while it's true that, you know, but in a certain way, if you said Rawls's theory of justice, so he's got a theory of justice, do you take that to be a work in metaethics or substantive moral and political philosophy? I'm asking you sincerely, because the theory of legitimate authority is like a theory of justice. I mean, and I don't see that there's a lot at stake in saying, well, Rawls is not really a political philosopher, he's a metaethicist, right? You'd want to say he's a substantive political philosopher. So for the same reasons that you want to say Rawls is a substantive political philosopher because he has a general theory of justice, offering a general account of the nature of legitimate authority is to me the same kind of activity.
Next, Robert Alexi.
What? You don't need a microphone. What? You need two turntables and a microphone.
Thank you.
That was a subtle
I have
and
one.
deep comment.
Yes. When I read Joseph Ratz or hear your lecture today, then I come to the question of whether there at all exists legal positivists nowadays. You say that separability or the separation thesis is of no theoretical or only a low theoretical value, or of no value, and the connection thesis is the same. And you present, instead of this, something like a continuity thesis. That is, not a connection between law and morality, but something like a mix. And I agree fully with you that we need moral reasons to have reasons at all for authoritative or institutional reasons. That is a kind, in former times, one would have called this normative positivism or positivism based on morality. One of the greatest examples of this in the history of legal thinking is Kant's form of backing law on moral reasons. And Kant too says that in law we may rest only on authoritative reason. Kant has had a kind of exclusive positivism based on morality. And I think that is extremely important that we make a distinction between persons and ideas. The persons, Ratz or Coleman, say we are positivists. Or perhaps you want to say today, I'm not longer a positivist. Perhaps you should do. And I would be glad to hear this from you. Well, you can be, I think, a positivist and you can back the authoritativeness of law by moral reason. I fully agree. And then the second question appears when you have established the authoritative or institutional reasons by reasons of morality, then you have to continue. Then you are in the realm of law, and then you have to ask a second question. Not only backing institutional reason by morality, but what to do with what Hart, I think, convincingly has characterized as open texture, and what is a fundamental feature of law. If you want to employ in the great open texture of law, again, moral reasons. And I think that is the second question. And here, I think, the connection thesis and the separation or separability thesis is an eternal question. You cannot say, once we had this problem and nowadays we have other problems. There are, for I think logical or quasi-logical reasons, there are problems which always will be there as long as we have law. And you have to answer the question, and that is now my question, what is in the, how should we conceive the application of law or legal reasoning? Should we apply moral reasons if the authoritative reasons are not enough to decide a case? And is this only, and I think Ratz would say naturally we should apply moral reasons when deciding a case. For as you have said in his paper on inclusion, we are always subject to morality. But if we are always subject to morality, and then and cannot do it different, I think that means to say that morality, if we are always subject to morality, and we cannot do, if we do our job in the right way, if we cannot do anything different from being moral in applicating law, I think that is a declaration of non-positivism. And I think positivism nowadays, in the forms we receive it, is completely different, for instance, from Kelsen. Kelsen insisted we have no moral reasons behind the law, and we have no moral reason in the law. The positivists nowadays say we have moral reasons behind the law and we have moral reasons in the law. Why do we any longer call this legal positivism?
Well, you really want to know? Well, there's nothing I would rather do today more than make you happy, but I'm not going to do that, and that pains me. I'm not going to reveal myself as a non-positivist. Okay, so let me explain what positivism is then. Positivism is a thesis. Of course, people can call positivism whatever they want to call it, okay? And they can pick out Kelsen as the paradigmatic positivist. That's fine. And then say everybody else is not really a positivist because they differ in fundamental ways from Kelsen. But I think the point that I want to make is the following. Positivism should be understood as a view about the determinants of legal content, as a metaphysical thesis. It's not a thesis about the relationship of the, it has implications for how we're to think about the relationship between the this is the second part of my paper, book or whatever it is, about the relationship of the normative dimensions of law to the metaphysical dimensions of law. It may have implications about the relationship of the semantics of legal discourse to the metaphysics of law, but first and foremost, it's a claim about the metaphysics of law, which I will now articulate. And that is, if we adopt the view that legal facts are not basic facts, that they are facts in virtue of other facts, positivism and natural law and other theories are theories about the constitutive elements of the facts in virtue of which there are legal facts. And positivism holds now, what people call exclusive legal positivism would be the view that only facts about behavior and attitude can be the determinants of legal facts. In other words, necessarily only facts about behavior and attitude. And that follows. That is not something that people just hold because they want to hold it to be called a positivist. For Raz, for example, that follows from the view that we always have moral reasons for acting and we should act on other reasons only under certain conditions. And then there's a long argument that gets you to that spot, that the constitutive elements of legal facts are social facts only. We don't starting out with positivism is unmotivated. Positivism must be motivated. And for someone like Raz, it's motivated from this picture of the conjunction of a variety of ideas that to be agents is to be responsive to moral reasons, and moral reasons sometimes tell us to act on reasons other than moral reasons, and these are sometimes authoritative reasons, and in order for them to operate as authoritative reasons, their content must be fixed in certain kinds of ways. So positivism is something for Raz and for others that must be motivated, and for him it's motivated this way. It's not a desire, I want to be called a positivist. I don't think he cares for 1 second whether people think of him in the same breath as Kelsen, right? Or that is just not the issue. Now, for inclusive legal positivism, this is one of the reasons why I am happy and proud to have been associated with inclusive legal positivism. In fact, I may never be invited back to Europe. My whole reputation will be ruined by what I say here today. Inclusive legal positivism is not so motivated. Inclusive legal positivism is the view that only social facts can fix the determinants of legal content. And that can be, social facts can sometimes say, evaluative and moral facts can fix the content of law, provided the relevant social facts make it the case, all right? But that is not a position that is derived from anything else, right? Okay? But that, so both are metaphysical positions. Inclusive and exclusive legal positivism should be both understood as metaphysical positions. They're positions about what are the facts in virtue of which legal facts obtain. Now, then we can ask a variety of other questions about how we should understand legal discourse and legal reasoning, right? Now, there can be, once one has a theory with the metaphysics in place, one could then develop a theory about how legal reasoning goes or how the semantics goes and so on and so forth. And I understand that people want to attribute to legal positivism, it's not really legal positivism unless it has a particular answer to each of these questions of a certain sort. And I'm just want to resist that idea. But I also, if it's a consequence of resisting that idea that legal positivism is not interesting, I want to resist that idea too. Because it is interesting to ask, what are the necessary features of law? What are the constitutive elements of legal facts? And is this, if you're a positivist, then you can ask the question, well, if you're someone like Raz or myself and you believe that legal judgments are judgments that should be understood as claims about what we have moral reason to do, then you have a good question to ask. Is this semantics supportable by this metaphysics? That's a good question to ask, right? If you believe that legal claims are claims about what you have moral reason to do, but you think that the constitutive elements of law are only facts about what people say and do, and the attitudes they have towards saying and doing, then is this semantics supportable by this metaphysics? All right. So I actually think, and then there's a good question about whether legal judgments, if there are judgments, can be derived from is judgments. You know, all those questions still remain. So I do think that the core idea of legal positivism is some version or other of the social facts thesis. And that is perfectly compatible with there being morality in the background. In fact, for Raz, it's the fact that morality is in the background that gives you the social fact thesis, right? And that there are moral reasons, that one must appeal to moral reasons to resolve certain kinds of legal disputes when we say there's a gap or something like this. I have very strong views against the open texture and so on. But that's an aside. I think those can be positivist views. But if people don't think they're positivist views because they associate positivism with a certain position, that's fine with me. That's fine with me. My view is a view about the constitutive elements of legal content. And I think we can draw interesting distinctions. Now, the connectedness thesis, I'm not saying is uninteresting, because if it's true, one of its implications is a claim about the content of the constitutive elements of legal content. That's contrary to positivism. It is that necessarily evaluative facts, as well as social facts, contribute to legal content. So I'm not saying that connectedness thesis is false or uninteresting. I'm saying if true, it actually has an implication that's contrary to my view about the content of the constituents of legal content. So I'm saying the separability thesis, just saying that the concepts of law and morality are separated or connected, in certain ways, that by itself is not interesting. What's interesting are distinctive formulations.
Next on my list is Eugenio Buligin, then Pierluigi Chiassoni, then Brian Biggs, and then Carlos Bernal. And I think we can't take any more, and I hope we
Yes.
can manage with those.
That's fine with me.
Well, while explaining the different approaches of positivism and natural laws to the separability thesis, you resort to a metaphor of hearts. Hearts functioning well, pumping blood, and defective hearts. And you conclude with the following phrase on page 10. Successful laws essentially express moral requirements or permissions, and thus defective laws fall short precisely by purporting to do so, but not in fact doing so. And in this sense, defective laws, even valid laws, are no laws at all. This sounds to me like a contradiction. Would you say that defective hearts are no hearts at all?
Wait. You can sit down, but I didn't mean you had to stay up to hear me. Look, I'm talking about, that's not my position. I'm articulating one way of understanding the natural law position. So I'm trying to make sense of the natural law position that a bad law is no law at all, or by saying that it's defective in a way that robs it of its being law. It's law in a weak sense. No, so I'm saying that the analogy is analogy with hearts. So when we want to understand, forget the last sentence for a second. The key idea is that when we study hearts, we don't look around at all the possible hearts in the world and ask, what do they have in common? That's not how we study what hearts are. We try to figure out what a successful heart does to understand what hearts are. And then, when this is helpful to us because we now understand what it is for a heart to be defective. Right? So the natural lawyer, by telling us to look at the successful case of law, the one in which the law actually imposes obligations and meets its aspirations, it's not just an aspirational view, it actually has explanatory value. It now gives us a sense of what it is when law, though valid, right, is nevertheless defective. And then when I said in the last sentence that it's no law at all, it's not law in the full sense of law, namely something that binds the conscience. That's all it's intended to do, and it was certainly not my position. I was trying to understand how we can make sense of the natural lawyer claim that bad law is no law at all. We should understand there's a methodological claim, an outcome of a methodological approach in which we look at the successful case first. That's all I was trying to do. Unsuccessful, no doubt, but I was not articulating my own view.
Pierluigi Chiassoni.
I think that the picture of the future you have outlined for jurisprudence is a future of confusion, actually, because legal theory and political philosophy gets mixed up like in a washing machine. And in that sense, your picture seems to be old stuff, like pre-Benthamite. Because if we take Bentham, no, you have legal theory and you have political philosophy. And a good jurist ought to do both. But to do both properly, you have to consider them as separate and conspiring enterprises. So the descriptive normative divide is very helpful while you are throwing it away, and the outcome cannot be but confusion. But I would like to be your...
Well, I've got nothing against confusion, though I actually think that what I tried to do is quite clarifying and not confusing in the following way. I am not advocating that jurisprudence should be approached from the position of political philosophy. That is, if one understood me to be advocating anything of that sort, that would be a confusion for which I take full responsibility. Actually, I'm not. Ultimately, that we have two general approaches to jurisprudence. It has nothing to do with descriptive versus normative. It has to do with whether you want to see law as fundamentally continuous with other aspects of our social life, or as fundamentally connected and continuous with morality and political morality. And one could approach either of those descriptively or normatively, depending upon one's view about how to address questions in jurisprudence. My aim was to identify that this divide is the real divide. The divide between those like myself, Hart, Scott Shapiro, for example, who believe that to understand law, essentially, is to see it in its relationship to other aspects of our social life, as continuous with our forms of social organization. And those like Raz and Dworkin and Finnis, and perhaps Professor Alexi, who see it as continuous with and fundamentally connected to our moral life. How they approach it methodologically is not my point. My point is to get clarification that this is the fundamental issue. Because those of us who see it as primarily continuous with other aspects of our social life then explore and ask the question, what sort of normativity does this sort of social organization naturally give rise to? What is the kind of normativity that we typically think of? And the fundamental idea is that the fundamental normativity of social organization is instrumental rationality and the like. Whereas for those who focus primarily on law's continuity with morality, the question that they ask is, what difference does law make in moral space, and what must be true of law in order for it to make that difference? So I am not asking for confusion or inviting confusion. I'm trying to invite clarification by seeing that this is the fundamental issue that won't go away. The other ones about, and there are other problems that won't go away either, but focusing as we have on whether morality is a condition of validity or so on, they're not, I just have to get this out while I'm here. Validity is not a legal idea that a theory of jurisprudence must be responsive to. Validity is an artifact of a theory of certain jurisprudential views. That is, there are certain jurisprudential views can do without the very notion of validity. And validity is not some phenomena in the legal world that a theory has to explain. So then asking questions about whether morality is a condition of legal validity is already to find yourself a victim of a certain theoretical strand. I want to get rid of all that. I feel like I'm running for president. I want to change all that. I want to bring about the change in jurisprudence that we can all believe in. Or at least, I believe it.
Brian Bix.
Hello? Yeah. It was a wonderfully thoughtful paper. Every few years I hear you give a paper and you remake the whole scene of jurisprudence. That's always keeps us going, keeps us alive. Though throughout the paper, the person who kept coming to mind, as I'm sure everyone else who listens to you comes to mind, is John Finnis. So Finnis's view is, amongst other things, that there's nothing the legal positivists have said that either isn't a commonplace or trivial. He says we need to focus on not the what of law, but the why of law. And that's what I kept hearing. And then in answer to Alexei, you say, well, what is it that makes you a legal positivist? And you say, well, what it is it's the metaphysics. It's the metaphysics of law. It's the facts that that ground the legal content. Now, I don't see any reason why anything Finnis has written is inconsistent with that. Anything Aquinas, anything Mark Murphy has written is inconsistent with that. Now, that's not to say this is a trivial point, because there are opponents out there, and that's good. It's good to have a position that there are significant opponents, but the only two that come to mind are Mark Greenberg and Ronald Dworkin. And that's fine. We can divide up the world that way, and maybe what you're trying to tell us is that all this legal positivism, natural law theory is not helpful, and you have been trying to say that, and instead we should say, here's the metaphysics of law, here's the semantics of law, here's the proper approach to legal reasoning, and legal positive natural law is not the dividing line, it's those kind of amorphous Greenberg-Dworkinians over there, and us, straightforward Rawls, Coleman, whatever, metaphysicians over here. Is that a proper restatement of the view?
Well, I don't know whether I honestly don't know whether the only people who believe that necessarily evaluative fact, I think Alexei clearly falls on the side of those, this may be the worst thing that's ever happened to you, to be lumped together with Ronald Dworkin in this way. He's a fine dresser, but but there might be, I do think that there are people who believe that necessarily social facts do not fix the content, they're inadequate to fix the content of law, and that Alexei is among them. So I don't know whether Finnis is among them. I just don't want to, to be perfectly honest, I don't care whether something is called positivism or not. I care whether we make progress on understanding the relationship of legal facts to those things in virtue of which they are legal facts. I care whether or not we make progress on understanding that legal statements should be understood as statements of a certain sort. I care whether or not that is compatible with various views about what the content of legal facts are. I care about whether and under what conditions law can give rise to reasons without it being the case that one's a reductionist about reasons. I care about those issues. I don't care about the names. And I don't see why anybody should. And that's why I'm proud to be a positivist. Because there's so little at stake.
Carlos Bernal.
Thank you very much. I find really very interesting your distinction between the fundamental sociality of law and the fundamental morality of law, these difference of approaches. But I would like to ask you whether you think that what we actually need is both of them. For instance, we can agree that the law is a collective intentional activity. And for instance, there are some things in the law that are impossible to explain if we just think that a law is continuous with morality. For instance, the idea of empowerment. The power-conferring norms are more likely to be explained if we think as the law of the law as a social institution that is a collective intentional activity. But on the other hand, if we compare the law with other collective intentional activities, and we can take some examples of from the literature of social ontology, painting a house, taking a walk together, playing chess, massive collective intentional activities like being in a huge corporation, working for a multinational corporation. Maybe the special feature of the law or one of the special features of the laws is the connection to morality, in which the way in which the law is related to morality. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure that I got. Look, I think that my fundamental point is that this divide has survived. And it's survived because there seems to be something missing in both pictures, right? Now, do I believe that we can't do it with just one picture, and that there will always be this incompatible divide, and we need both, right? Do I believe that? Well, frankly, no, I don't believe that. But I don't have an argument. I'm just trying to, at this point, introduce what I think are the fundamental dividing lines. So I don't think positivism, non-positivism is the fundamental dividing line. I think different views about the constitutive elements of legal facts are. I don't think, and I do think that the fundamental divide is those who think law, primarily what you want to explain is it's the difference law makes in moral space, and those people who think that the fundamental thing you want to understand about law is the way it's connected to other aspects of our social life. Now, do I think at the end of the day there isn't going to be a really compelling theory on one side or the other? No, I don't believe that. But I don't have that theory yet, at all. But I'm just trying to identify where I think the real issues lie and the right ways to approach them, not their resolution. I'm just trying to clear the deck, have us rethink the field, categorize things and formulate things differently so that we can make progress, not so that I could advance a view. I don't have a view. I have an architecture.
I think I miscalculated. We have 5 more minutes and we can take one more question. I think the lady here. Here.
Thank you very much for allowing me to address this comment. I want to refer to your point that resemblances, similarities between theories are important and illuminating, and we should take them into account and not just focus on the differences. And I agree with you that these might be important because perhaps what similarities show between different conceptions is that common ground of discussion, the common assumptions, and perhaps and connecting this discussion to the one that we had yesterday on necessary and sufficient conditions for the concept of law. Perhaps this common ground is connected to what we consider as being necessary and sufficient conditions for saying what law is. On the other hand, it seems to me that differences are also important, and we don't have to go, to an extreme. Of course, differences could be of several types. There could be artificial differences, artificially induced by, let's say, and I'm going to formulate not a methodological argument, but a rather practical one. perhaps the way we do jurisprudence and we teach jurisprudence and our need for organizing and classifying conceptions within jurisprudence creates artificial differences between conceptions that are not in the first place. On the other hand, there seems to be some genuine differences which we shouldn't forget, and those could also be illuminating in addition to the resemblances, because those could provide those, let's say, what we called yesterday the important but non-necessary conditions for defining what law is. So even if, on one hand, it is illuminating to see the similarities between positions such as Raz's and Dworkin's, because it shows what two major scholars believe that there are unproblematic assumptions about law. On the other hand, the differences between them are equally important because they show or they reveal those important but unnecessary or not universal features that law might have. What do you think? How much should we, or how much would you emphasize on the resemblances, the similarities, and the differences?
Well,
thank you.
Thank you. Just on Raz and Dworkin for a second, my entire point was to show that their differences derive from what they share. That is, you wouldn't really understand Dworkin believes that necessarily moral or evaluative as well as social facts fix the content of law, and Raz believes that only social facts can fix the content of law. That's a big difference. I was not denying that that's a big difference. I don't know that there's a bigger difference than that difference. That is the important difference. But my whole point was, what's really interesting is to see that that difference has roots in deeply common ground. It isn't to emphasize the common ground at the expense of the difference. It's actually to illuminate that the differences derive from common point of departure, that the fundamental way to illuminate jurisprudence is to see its continuity, law's continuity with morality, and to see that one cannot approach questions in jurisprudence other than through questions in first-order political morality. And with that common ground, you nevertheless end up with these fundamentally different views about the constitutive elements of law, legal facts. My entire point is not to dismiss the difference, but to show us where the differences actually come from. And my aim is not in general to make light of or eliminate important differences. It's to identify which differences are important and why. I want us not to be distracted by less significant differences so that we might better focus on the differences that matter. If we don't, we won't make real progress. That's my thought.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent session. We meet again at 11:50.